Sometimes I think our house is made of glass. Everything shines, but nothing feels solid. Every wall reflects a polished version of what we never really were, a happy family. Joseph spends his days lying in the upstairs bedroom. The sunlight filters through the white curtains, touching his pale face, tired but still proud. The man who once ruled a textile empire can barely hold a glass of water now, yet his arrogance remains untouched. His body may be weak, but the poison still runs through his veins. The sound of medical machines merges with the ticking of the old clock in the hall. Everything in this house seems to count down his decay. I walk slowly, staring at the framed family portraits, every photo carefully chosen by him. No mistakes, no shadows, no color, all white, all perfect, all lies. When the doctors confirmed the leukemia, I hoped it would soften him, that the pain might crack him open and let some trace of humanity escape. But Joseph only grew harder, colder. He talks about business, politics, God, and morality, but never about love. At dinner last night, he looked at the children and said, in that dry, sharp tone, "I want one of you to be a match. I will not die." But he didn't look at me. He never does. It's as if the world is a mirror, and he only accepts the reflection of himself. When the nurse left, I stayed beside him. His breathing was short and shallow. The smell of medicine filled the air, but what suffocated me wasn't the hospital scent. It was the silence. I asked if he was afraid. He answered, "What would I be afraid of, Susan? I have no sins." That was when I realized how far he'd gone from himself. His true sin wasn't in what he'd done, but in what he'd denied. He built walls of glass, beautiful, but fragile. And now, surrounded by luxury, he lives in a prison where his reflection is the only companion left. Sometimes, late at night, I hear him cry, muffled, quick. He'll never admit it. Maybe he cries out of fear of death, or maybe for something older, something he's been hiding for decades. I don't know yet what it is, but there's something he never wanted to surface. Something that makes his face harden whenever he hears a certain name. A name I still can't say out loud. But deep inside, I know that name will change everything. Hospitals always feel like places where time holds its breath. Inside them, people inhale hope and fear in the same heartbeat. I arrived early that morning. Joseph was being prepared for another round of tests, and the doctor called me into the hallway with a look I will never forget. "Mrs. Miller, we need to talk about the results." He led me into a small cold room, too cold for the size of the words that were coming. None of the 3 children were compatible. Richard tried to hide his disappointment, but I saw the tears gathering in his eyes. Emily cried quietly, and Thomas just lowered his head, defeated. When Joseph found out, he laughed. A dry metallic laugh, sharp enough to cut through pity. "Impossible. You people must have made a mistake. Run the test again, doctor. My children can't be incompatible with me. They are my blood," the doctor explained calmly. But Joseph didn't listen. He never listens. Reality for him has always been something that must bow to his will. Later that night when we were alone, he looked at me with those feverish eyes and said, "These doctors are idiots. My blood is pure, Susan. It's always been pure." I wanted to argue, but I didn't. I've learned that fighting Joseph is like trying to put out fire with gasoline. That night, while he slept, I went downstairs to leave some documents at the nurse's station. That's when I overheard 2 of them talking. They mentioned a young man who had come in for a compatibility test, someone outside the family. I stopped walking. One of them said his name Noah, a name that froze the air in my lungs. Noah, the name Joseph had forbidden inside our home. The name he once whispered, years ago, half drunk and trembling. If you ever hear that name, pretend you didn't. He doesn't exist. But now the impossible was happening. That name, the one he buried in shame, was back. And not just back, it was the only thing standing between him and death. I drove home barely breathing. When I looked at Joseph sleeping in that enormous bed, surrounded by machines, I thought, he has no idea that the life he despises most is the one about to save him. I closed the curtains, sat down on the cold floor, and cried not out of sorrow, but because destiny has a cruel sense of irony, and this irony was only beginning. I didn't sleep that night while Joseph breathed beside me, slow, mechanical, half alive. I stared at his reflection in the window, wondering if he could sense it. The name, the one he tried to erase from the world. Morning came pale and quiet. I was making coffee when the phone rang. It was the doctor. His voice sounded different, cautious, heavy. "Mrs. Miller, could you come to the hospital? There's something you should know." When I arrived, he was waiting with a folder in his hands. "Mrs. Miller," he began, "we've found a perfect donor, 100% compatible." My heart skipped. Before I could ask, he added softly, "His name is Noah." The room tilted. My fingers went cold. "Is he family?" I managed to whisper. The doctor hesitated. He didn't say much, just that he wanted to help in secret. In secret. That word hit me like a wave, because only those who've been forced to hide understand what silence costs. I looked out the window, trying to imagine a face I'd never seen. Noah. The child Joseph had rejected before birth. The boy he once described, drunk and bitter, as the worst mistake of my life. I remember that night clearly. Joseph had been drinking, talking too loud, bragging about control and purity. Then his voice cracked. He confessed that long before me, he had been weak once, that a black waitress tricked him, and that from that night came something that should never have existed. Back then, I was too young to understand the poison in those words. Now, with his body rotting from the inside, I finally did. I drove home slowly, every mile heavier than the last. When I walked into his room, Joseph was awake, staring at the ceiling. I tried to hint at what was coming. "Joseph," I said carefully, "what if someone unexpected could help you?" He turned his face toward me, his expression turning to stone. "I don't want help from anyone who isn't my blood, Susan. And I know exactly who my family is." His tone was a wall, final, impenetrable. And for the first time in years, I felt afraid. Not of his illness, but of what would happen when he learned the truth. Because fate was about to place father and son face to face, and none of us would come out untouched. I never believed the past could have a smell, until that morning, when I opened Joseph's old office. The air was thick with dust and the sour trace of whiskey. It was the scent of time that never moved on. Inside the bottom drawer, I found a small wooden box lined with velvet. Inside it, a few letters, faded photographs, and a broken necklace. At the bottom, a torn piece of paper, written in delicate handwriting. "He has your eyes, Joseph. Please, don't deny him. Her name was Marianne. She had been a waitress, one of the invisible women who orbit power without ever touching it. That was before the money, before the suits and speeches, before the man I married became a monument to pride. I sat down by the cold fireplace and let the image form in my mind. Joseph much younger, his tie-loose eyes heavy with anger and alcohol, and Marianne beautiful, shy, with dark luminous skin and a smile that could calm storms. He must have seen her as a temptation he needed to crush, a softness that threatened his control. That night he drank too much, and as with every man who mistakes strength for possession, he took what wasn't his. What came from that act was what he called his shame, a child, a boy named Noah. Marianne tried to tell him, tried to bring him into the light of responsibility, but Joseph shut the door on both of them, and when she walked away, she carried both her pain and his secret. She raised Noah on her own with the same grace she had that night in the bar, until illness took her too soon, leaving the boy in the care of her sister, Sarah. I wept as I read those letters. I realized then that Joseph's real sickness didn't begin in his blood, it began in his soul. The leukemia was only the body mirroring the decay inside him. I closed the box and looked at the mirror above the fireplace. Behind me, Joseph's old portrait stared back, the same sharp eyes that Noah must have inherited. In that moment, I knew what I had to do. If fate had placed Noah in Joseph's path again, it wasn't by chance. It was justice, or maybe mercy. Either way, I would find him. And even if Joseph hated me for it, I would bring his son back to him. Driving to Sarah's neighborhood felt like crossing into another country. I left behind the wide, manicured streets of Bellevue, and entered a place where the pavement cracked, and the houses stood close together, holding each other up like old friends. The GPS stopped at the end of a cul-de-sac, a modest house, small but alive. Clothes hung from a line in the yard, swaying in the wind. Through the open window, I smelled coffee and heard a radio playing softly, a hymn, I think. When the door opened, a woman stood before me. 60, maybe. Headscarf, rough hands, eyes that looked straight through a person's excuses. "You must be Sarah," I said, trying not to sound nervous. "Depends," she replied. "Who's asking?" I showed her my hospital badge. "My name is Susan Miller. I'm Joseph Miller's wife." The name hit the air like a slap. For a moment she didn't move. Then she folded her arms and said flatly, "That man's still breathing." I nodded. She shook her head, stepped aside, and gestured for me to come in. The house was humble but filled with soul. Family photos, books worn at the edges, vases made from jars, flowers everywhere. It was the opposite of my house, small, imperfect, and entirely human. Sarah poured coffee, then sat across from me. "So," she said, "what does the rich man's wife want here?" I took a breath. "I came to talk about Noah." At his name, her face softened and then hardened again. "What about him?" "He came to the hospital. He got tested for Joseph." Sarah looked down at her hands. Silence, long, heavy. When she finally spoke, her voice trembled slightly. "I begged him not to go. I begged him. But that boy." She shook her head. "He's got a heart that doesn't know how to hate." She told me everything. How Noah grew up hearing only half-truths and insults. How, at 7, he had drawn a picture of a man and wrote "Daddy" in crooked letters at the top. How he went to Joseph's house, full of hope, and was thrown out by a guard who said, "Your father doesn't want you here." Tears burned behind my eyes. Sarah watched me carefully. "So what does Joseph want from him now?" I hesitated. "He doesn't know yet." Sarah stood, went to a shelf, and came back with a photo. It was Noah, mid-20s, gentle smile, deep eyes that seemed older than his years. He looked like kindness itself. "He's a good man, Susan," she said softly. "Works hard, never complains, helps everyone. He never speaks badly of his father. He just says that one day, he hopes the man knows he doesn't hate him." Her words cut deeper than any accusation. Joseph didn't deserve that kind of grace, but Noah gave it anyway. At the door, before I left, Sarah took my hand. "If you have any heart left," she whispered, "don't let that boy get hurt again." I nodded, unable to speak. As I drove home, Noah's photo on the seat beside me, I realized something painful and true. For years, I thought I was married to a powerful man. But I had never seen real strength until I saw it in that photograph. Noah arrived at the hospital on a gray Tuesday morning. I already knew the truth that he was a perfect match, but he didn't know that I knew. And Joseph, trapped inside his own arrogance, would never imagine that the life he despised most carried the key to his survival. I sat in the waiting room pretending to be just another visitor. He was easy to spot sitting alone, his hands trembling slightly in his lap. He wore simple clothes, nothing remarkable. But there was something noble in the way he carried himself. The quiet dignity of someone who's been hurt deeply, yet still believes in kindness. When the receptionist called his name Noah Miller, my heart froze. Miller, he carried Joseph's last name like a scar that refused to fade. I walked toward him carefully. "Noah?" I asked softly. He looked up startled. His eyes, his eyes were Joseph's, but without the coldness. They had warmth, sadness, and a gentleness that made me want to cry. "I'm Susan," I said, my voice trembling. "Joseph's wife." He nodded, calm but guarded. "I know who you are," Sarah told me. We sat in silence. For a moment the hospital noise vanished. No machines, no voices, just breathing. "You didn't have to do this," I finally said. After everything, he interrupted me, gently. "I know. He never wanted to know me. But my mother taught me that when you can save a life, you do it. Even if that life once threw you away." There was no anger in his tone, only peace, the kind that makes you ashamed of your own comfort. The nurse appeared at the door. "Mr. Miller, we're ready for you." He stood, nodded to me, and disappeared into the lab. I stayed there, listening to the distant clinking of instruments, feeling the weight of my own heartbeat. I wanted to run to him, to apologize on behalf of a man who never would. When he returned, a small bandage covered his arm. "It's done," he said with a faint smile. "If it can help, then so be it." I looked at him, tears forming. "You have a heart this world doesn't deserve, Noah." He smiled again, eyes shining. "My mother used to say hate makes your soul old, but forgiveness lets you sleep in peace." That night, I sat by Joseph's bed holding the sealed test results. He slept pale, unaware. How could I tell him that the blood he called impure was the very blood that could keep his heart beating? Sometimes the greatest miracles aren't the ones that heal the body. They're the ones that force the soul to face its own reflection. The hospital room was silent, except for the steady rhythm of machines. The faint beeping was the only thing keeping time for a man who once believed he controlled it. Joseph looked small now, his body shrunken by disease, his power evaporating like air escaping a cracked glass. I held the envelope in my hands, the truth sealed inside. It felt heavier than any secret I'd ever carried. The doctor entered quietly. "Mr. Miller, we've found your perfect donor," he said. 100% compatible. The procedure can be arranged immediately." Joseph lifted his chin, his pride flickering back to life. "Finally," he said, "someone worthy of my blood." The doctor hesitated. His eyes shifted to me, silently asking permission to reveal the name. I shook my head gently. "I'll bring him in myself." In the hallway, Noah was waiting. He stood by the window, sunlight touching his face, calm and steady. When I approached, he met my eyes. "Does he know?" he asked quietly. "Not yet," I said. "But he will." Together, we walked back into the room. Joseph tried to sit up when he saw us. For a heartbeat, he froze, his expression twisted in disbelief. What is this boy doing here?" he demanded. Noah stepped closer, his voice soft but unwavering. "I came to offer what you need to live." The words seemed to echo off the walls. Joseph blinked, then let out a laugh. Short, sharp, poisonous. "This is a joke," he said, turning to me. "Tell me you've lost your mind, Susan." I held out the envelope, my hand shaking. "He's the match, Joseph. Your only chance." He stared at me, fury building in his eyes. "No, I don't accept it. I won't." "It's your son," I cried, my voice breaking. "The son you threw away." The silence that followed was unbearable. Joseph's face went cold, his voice turning to ice. "I don't have a black son," he said slowly. Then, after a long pause, he added with disgust. "And certainly not someone like that disgusting faggot." Noah lowered his head. No tears, just silence, the kind that carries years of pain too old for crying. "I only wanted to help," he said softly. "Even if you never wanted me, I still wanted you to live." Joseph turned his face to the wall. "I'd rather die than take a black man's blood." The doctor tried to reason with him. The children begged. I pleaded, but Joseph's heart was already locked. He shouted until his voice broke, ripping the four from his arm, declaring war on the very life trying to save him. Noah stood in the doorway, eyes full but steady. Then he looked at me and said quietly, "Now I understand why my mother said not every father knows how to be human." And with that, he walked away, leaving behind the only cure Joseph would ever refuse. That day, I learned something terrible and true. Pride doesn't just kill the body, it murders the soul first. That night stretched on forever. Even the rain outside seemed angry, striking the hospital windows like it wanted to break in. The corridors smelled of medicine and despair. Somewhere a monitor beeped with the rhythm of a heart that refused to learn humility. Joseph was restless, half-conscious, muttering words that didn't belong to prayers. The disease was winning, but even as his body collapsed, his arrogance clung to him like a second skin. I sat in the chair beside his bed, the coffee in my hands long gone cold. His breath came short, ragged. When he opened his eyes, they burned with the same fire that had kept him alive for all the wrong reasons. "I don't want him here," he said suddenly. "Joseph, please, he only wanted to help." "Shut up," he screamed, the voice hoarse, breaking. "That boy is my shame. I don't want to hear his name." The doctor rushed in, trying to calm him. Joseph pushed his hands away. Anger seemed to give him strength. The cruel irony of a man who only felt alive when hating. His children arrived soon after. Emily fell to her knees, holding his hand. "Daddy, please," she begged through tears. "He's your son. He's trying to save you." Joseph yanked his hand free. "I fathered no black child." Thomas, the youngest, shouted through tears, "You're dying, father." "Then I'll die clean," he roared. "Pure." His voice echoed down the hallway. Nurses came running. Machines beeped an alarm. Joseph tore the four from his arm, blood spotting the sheets, his face red with fury and shame. "I don't want his blood," he howled. "I don't want it." I had never seen him cry before, but now he did, not from remorse, but from terror. The terror of seeing the mirror too clearly. In the hallway, Noah stood frozen. He had heard everything. Sarah was beside him, tears falling silently. I ran to him, desperate. "Noah, please, don't let this break you. He's sick." Noah looked at me, and in his eyes I saw peace, not anger. "Don't worry, Mrs. Miller," he said quietly. "He's already paying for what he's done. He just doesn't know it yet." Then he turned and walked away. No shouting, no revenge. Only the quiet dignity of someone who understands that forgiveness sometimes means letting go. When I came back to the room, Joseph was collapsed against the pillows, exhausted, his chest rising and falling with effort. He had screamed his last strength into the air. The rain beat harder against the window. Somewhere a light flickered in the hallway, and for the first time, I realized it wasn't the storm that was shaking the hospital. It was our world, finally falling apart. 14 days. That's how long it took for death to finish what pride had started. The hospital no longer felt like a place of healing. It was a waiting room between repentance and denial. By the 5th day, Joseph had stopped eating. By the 8th, fever took hold. By the 10th, his voice was reduced to whispers, his mind wandering between memories and madness. Sometimes, he called out names I didn't know, and sometimes, he called Noah's. But even in delirium, his pride refused to surrender. "He's not my son, not my son," he would mutter, sweating, turning away as if from a mirror that accused him. The children came every day. Emily prayed in the corner, whispering pleas into the sterile air. Richard buried himself in paperwork, pretending control. Thomas sat in silence, eyes swollen, lost. No one spoke about what we all knew. He was choosing to die this way. On the 10th morning, I stood by the window watching the rain blur the world outside. My reflection on the glass looked like a stranger's pale, tired, hollow-eyed. The doctor's voice broke the stillness behind me. "Mrs. Miller, it won't be long now." "How long?" "Days," he said softly. "Maybe hours." I nodded. No tears, not anymore. At some point the body forgets how to cry. That afternoon Joseph opened his eyes and looked at me. His voice was barely a breath. "Susan, I'm here. I did the right thing, didn't I? I kept my family clean." I stared at him and saw not a monster, but a broken man drowning in his own delusion. "You destroyed your family, Joseph," I whispered. He closed his eyes. "They'll never understand." By the 12th day, he no longer recognized his children. By the 13th, the machines began to fail, and on the 14th, his heart simply stopped trying. The monitor line flattened. The steady beeping that had marked his stubborn existence faded into a single, endless tone. I stood beside the bed, looking at the body of the man who once promised me forever. I didn't feel anger or relief, just silence. The silence of someone who died long before his body did. When I stepped into the hallway, the world was quiet. Noah wasn't there, but on the bench, I found an envelope with my name. Inside, a short note. I prayed for him anyway, because in the end, forgiveness is the only inheritance I want, Noah. I folded the note and placed it over my heart. And at that moment, I realized the blood Joseph had rejected hadn't died with him. It was still alive, beating inside a man more worthy of life than Joseph ever was. The sky was gray the morning we buried Joseph Miller. It was as if even the sun refused to attend. A thin rain fell over the rows of black umbrellas, washing the faces of people who didn't quite know how to mourn a man who never learned to love. The service was held in the garden of the Miller estate. Everything looked perfect. The flowers, the music, the suits. But beneath the ceremony, there was only emptiness. Even the marble seemed ashamed to bear his name. He lay in a dark wooden coffin, wearing the same suit he had worn to sign his biggest business deal. The face was peaceful, almost noble. But it wasn't peace, it was the stillness of pride finally silenced. Richard stood stiff beside Emily, who cried quietly. Thomas kept his head down. I stood apart, watching as if it were a play performed for ghosts. Then I saw him, Noah. He stood at a distance, no umbrella, rain dripping down his face. He didn't move, didn't cry, just stood there, watching the man who had refused to see him in life. Sarah stood behind him, her hand on his shoulder, like a mother shielding her son from the cold world once more. The ceremony began. The pastor spoke of forgiveness, of redemption, of rest. But the words sounded hollow, a sermon for an audience too tired to believe. When he said, "May the Lord receive him in peace," something inside me tightened. Because peace had never been a place Joseph knew. When my turn came, I walked up to the coffin. The rain whispered against the wood. I looked down at his face and whispered, "You died without asking for forgiveness, but he forgave you anyway." Tears mixed with the rain on my cheeks. I took the folded note Noah had left me and slipped it inside the coffin, the only pure offering this man would ever receive. As the earth began to fall, each handful of wet soil hitting the wood sounded like punctuation, the period at the end of a long, cruel sentence. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw Noah kneel in the mud. He traced something on the ground with his finger, maybe a name, maybe a prayer. Then he stood, and as he passed me, he whispered softly, almost like a benediction, "May he find the peace he never gave." And then he walked away, disappearing into the mist. I stayed until the last shovel of dirt covered the coffin. The rain had stopped. The garden was silent again. Some dead rest easily. Others keep their weight on the living. Joseph Miller, I thought, would never be light enough to rise. 2 days after the funeral, the house still smelled of dead flowers. Every hallway, every polished surface seemed to whisper the same truth. Joseph was gone, but what he left behind wasn't an inheritance. It was a stain. The rooms echoed in the office. The blinds clicked softly in the wind, and the safe, that symbol of everything he'd built, looked like a tomb. That morning, I woke with a clarity I hadn't felt in years. It wasn't anger, it was justice. I called the family lawyer, Mr. Thompson, a careful man who had served Joseph for more than 2 decades. When he arrived, he carried a folder and the usual professional sympathy. "Mrs. Miller, my condolences. I assume you'd like to discuss the estate." I nodded, but when I placed a new folder on the desk, he noticed the difference in my eyes. "I don't want to discuss what Joseph left," I said. "I want to discuss what he took." I opened the folder, the DNA results, Marianne's letters, Noah's birth certificate. He read in silence. When he finished, he looked at me, startled. "You intend to?" "Yes," I said. "To recognize Noah legally as Joseph's son." He paused, removing his glasses. "Mrs. Miller, you realize the consequences, the inheritance, the name, the press." "I understand," I interrupted. "But I won't let the blood he denied continue to be treated like a mistake." We signed the papers that afternoon. The scratch of the pen across paper sounded like the first honest sound this house had ever heard. As I walked him out, I saw Richard standing in the doorway. He'd heard everything. His face flushed with anger. "You've lost your mind, Mother," he hissed. "You're giving Father's name to that." He stopped himself, choking on the word. I stepped toward him. "To that what, Richard?" I asked quietly. "To that man who showed more grace in one act than your father showed in a lifetime." He said nothing. Emily wept behind him. Thomas turned away. Not one of them met my eyes. That night, I sat in Joseph's empty office and signed the final page. The legal recognition of Noah Miller, son and heir of Joseph Miller. My hand trembled as the pen lifted from the paper, because I knew I was sealing more than a document. I was sealing a reckoning. When everyone left, I stayed behind. The portrait of Joseph still hung above the fireplace, watching. I looked straight at it. "I didn't do this for you," I whispered. "I did it for him, and maybe, a little for me." For the first time in years, I could breathe. Through the window, the moon reflected on the surface of the pool, and for once, the house of glass reflected something true. The news reached Noah on a quiet afternoon. The wind was soft, the kind that moves the curtains gently, and for once, the world around him didn't feel like an enemy. Sarah was cooking dinner when the phone rang. Her hands still smelled of garlic and soap when she answered. Her face changed as she listened, her eyes wide, her voice trembling. She handed the phone to Noah. "Someone wants to speak to you," she whispered. A man's voice came through, formal, careful. "Mr. Noah Miller, I'm calling on behalf of Mrs. Susan Miller. I'm pleased to inform you that she has legally recognized you as the son of Joseph Miller. You are now, by law, one of his heirs." Noah didn't speak. The voice continued, "The inheritance amounts to $3 million. Silence. Only the faint crackle of Sarah's cooking filled the room. Noah's hand trembled. It wasn't disbelief about the money. It was the weight of irony. All his life, he had been told he was worth nothing. Now, the same name that had cursed him was the one giving him back a future. That evening, I drove to see him. He was sitting on the porch, the light of sunset painting his face gold. The neighborhood kids were laughing nearby. Life went on, unbothered by destiny's twists. "I don't know what to do with this," he said as I sat beside him. "Do whatever brings peace to your heart," I told him. "Money can fix houses, but not souls." He smiled faintly. "I don't want to fix the past. I just want to make it mean something." In the weeks that followed, he did exactly that. He paid off Sarah's debts, helped his siblings, and donated a large sum to a foundation that supported young people rejected for who they were. "People," he said, "who just want to be loved." With what remained, he bought a small house, not luxurious, but warm. Plants by the window, laughter in the kitchen, the smell of coffee in the mornings. Everything his father's money had never been able to buy. Peace. A reporter tried to interview him once. He declined politely. "I'm not a story," he said. "I'm just a person trying to forgive." And in that silence, he began to exist fully for the first time. Not as a bastard, not as a charity case, but as Noah Miller, a man who turned rejection into grace. From afar, I watched him live, sometimes from my car, sometimes from my thoughts. And every time I thought of Joseph, I realized something simple. His fortune didn't save his soul, but it might have saved someone else's. There are things you only notice when the noise finally stops. After Joseph's death, the house felt enormous, too clean, too still. I spent my days rearranging things that didn't need to be moved, as if keeping my hands busy could silence my heart. One afternoon, I opened a drawer I hadn't touched in years. Inside was a photograph, yellowed, dusty, almost forgotten. Joseph, in his 20s, young, handsome, smiling in a way I had never seen while he was alive. I sat by the fireplace, staring at that frozen version of him. And then it struck me, the eyes. They were Noah's. The same deep, calm gaze. The same quiet sadness. As if both men were born carrying something too heavy for one lifetime. I lifted the photo closer. The tilt of the head, the curve of the mouth, even the small scar above the eyebrow, identical. For a long time I couldn't breathe. It was as if the past and the present had collided in that single piece of paper. The truth Joseph had buried was staring right back at me. The blood he called impure had his own face. I found a small mirror on the desk, and placed it beside the photo. In that reflection glass and image side by side, I saw what Joseph feared most, that you can't erase yourself from your own creation. Tears fell, not from anger, but from mourning what never existed. The father who never said my son. The apology that never came. The love that never learned to speak. That night, I dreamed of Joseph. He was sitting on the porch of our old house, staring at the horizon. Next to him sat a little boy, Noah, maybe 7 years old, drawing circles on the ground with a piece of charcoal. Joseph watched him quietly, and for the first time, he smiled. I woke up with my pillow damp and my chest strangely light. Maybe it was just a dream. Or maybe it was forgiveness, arriving late but real. I took the photograph and placed it above the fireplace. Next to it, I put the picture of Noah that Sarah had once sent me. 2 faces. One story, finally side by side, where they always belonged. Some truths way too much to say aloud. So I wrote instead. The house was silent that morning, sunlight leaking through the curtains like mercy. I sat at the kitchen table with the same stationery Joseph once used for contracts. This time, the paper would carry something real. Not numbers, not deals, but repentance. I took a deep breath, lifted the pen, and began. Dear Noah, I write this because there's no other way to say what has been trapped for years. You owe me nothing, but I owe you the world. I was complicit in silence, out of fear, comfort, and cowardice. I let cruelty live under my roof. I watched Joseph deny you, your color, your truth, your very right to exist, and I said nothing. I told myself time would fix what justice ignored. But time only heals those who wish to be healed. When you appeared at the hospital, I thought it was God testing me, but now I know it wasn't a test. It was a mirror. You reflected everything Joseph tried to bury. And unlike him, you didn't need power or wealth to be noble. You were born with grace. He died never knowing who you were. But I do. And as long as I live, the name Miller will no longer stand for shame. It will stand for you. For the man who forgave what the world refused to see. What Joseph called a mistake, I will call a miracle. If you ever look to the sky and feel unseen, remember this. Somewhere, there is a woman who carries your story in her heart. With love, Susan. When I finished, I folded the letter slowly, as if sealing a wound. It wasn't an apology, it was a surrender. A way to say that while we can't rewrite the past, we can still choose to speak truth before it's too late. I mailed the letter that same afternoon, and as the postman walked away, I felt something inside me finally let go. That night, I sat on the porch with a cup of tea and looked at the moon. It was full, bright, unflinching. I wondered if Noah saw the same moon from wherever he was. For the first time in a very long while, I breathed, and it didn't hurt. Some words, when finally spoken, don't echo. They set you free. The cemetery was empty that autumn morning. The wind carried the scent of damp earth, and the sound of church bells drifted faintly from the distance, as if time itself was offering its condolences. I arrived first. I brought simple white flowers, not for Joseph, but for the memory of what might have been, for the love he never learned to give. A few minutes later, I saw Noah walking up the path, alone. His coat caught in the wind, his steps slow, deliberate. He held something small in his hand, a glass vial. He stopped in front of the grave, and knelt. The morning light hit his face, and for a moment, I could see both him and Joseph there, the same eyes, but a completely different soul. He opened the vial and took out a single drop of his own blood. Then, gently, he let it fall onto the soil covering his father's coffin. The red sank into the earth like a quiet declaration. Even though you hated me, he whispered, I would have saved you. Because the love my mother taught me was stronger than the hate you taught yourself. His words broke the air. Not loud, but eternal. I couldn't move. The world seemed to stand still around that one act, a son blessing the ground where his father's pride had turned to dust. He stood, brushed the dirt from his knees, and looked at me. Thank you, Mrs. Miller, for everything. I didn't do anything, Noah, I said softly. You did, he smiled. That same quiet, forgiving smile that seemed older than his years. Then he turned and walked away, down the dirt path, disappearing into the trees, the wind carrying his name where no curse could follow. I stayed. The morning sun crept higher, bathing the tombstone in gold, and I thought, Joseph died of disease, yes, but what truly killed him was pride. The same pride that couldn't stop the blood he denied from flowing on. That blood was still alive, walking, breathing, forgiving. That blood was Noah. I closed my eyes, let the wind lift the last petals from my hand, and whispered to the empty air. Some die of illness, others, of hatred, but love. Love always survives. If this story touched your heart, leave a like, subscribe, and share it with someone who believes that love can still heal what hate destroys. See you in the next story.